I left India at 26 years old, convinced that Dubai was going to make me rich. I said goodbye to my parents, made promises I truly believed I would keep, and boarded a flight thinking that in just a few years, I would come back as a different man, successful, wealthy, someone my whole town would admire. What I did not know was that the real cost of that dream was not going to be measured in money. It was going to be measured in birthdays I missed, in friendships that quietly disappeared, in a father who looked at me from a hospital bed and said only 2 words that broke something inside me. By the time I finally understood what I had actually lost out there, it was almost too late to fix it. This is the story of what really happened to me in Dubai, and it is not the story I thought I was going to tell. There are nights when I lie awake and try to remember the exact moment my family started feeling like strangers to me. I cannot find it. There was no single conversation, no single fight, no single goodbye that broke us. It happened slowly, in the gaps between phone calls that grew longer and longer, until one day I realized the people who knew me best now knew almost nothing about my life at all. I used to think money was the only thing I was risking when I left home. I was wrong. I risked everything, and I did not even understand the bet I was making until it was already lost. My name is Vikrant. I am 33 years old now, though when this story begins I was only 26, full of a kind of hunger that I think only people from small towns truly understand. I grew up in a modest town in India, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where news travels faster than the morning bus, and where success is measured very plainly. If a man went abroad and came back with new clothes, a better phone, gifts for his parents, and stories about tall buildings and air-conditioned malls, he was considered a success. It did not matter what he actually did there, or what it cost him. What mattered was the way people looked at him when he walked through the market. I wanted that. I wanted people to look at me that way. My father worked as a clerk for most of his life, and my mother managed our home with a kind of quiet patience that I did not appreciate until much later. We were not poor, but we were never comfortable either. There was always a calculation happening in the background of our lives. Whether we could afford new school books, whether a wedding gift could be a little smaller this year, whether a doctor's visit could wait another month. I grew up watching my parents do this silent math every single day, and somewhere along the way I promised myself I would change it. I would be the one who made the math easier. So when a distant relative mentioned that a company in Dubai was hiring workers from our region, I did not hesitate. I did not ask too many questions about the job itself, the housing, the hours, or the real cost of living there. All I heard was Dubai, and in my mind, that word already meant gold. I had heard stories my entire life, men who left as nobody and returned as somebody, men who built houses for their parents, paid for their sisters' weddings, sent their children to good schools, all because they had gone abroad and worked hard. I believed, without any real evidence, that if they could do it, so could I. The weeks before I left were strange. There was excitement, yes, but there was also a heaviness I did not know how to name at the time. My mother kept finding small reasons to be near me, folding my clothes again, even though they were already folded, asking if I had packed enough warm layers for the flight, asking the same questions twice as if repeating them might somehow keep me there a little longer. My father said very little, which was his way of showing emotion. The night before I left, he sat with me on the small veranda outside our house and said only one sentence that I still remember word for word. Just don't forget who is waiting for you here. I told him I would never forget. I meant it completely, and yet, somehow, that promise became one of the hardest ones to keep. When I landed in Dubai, the city looked exactly like the pictures, perhaps even more dazzling. Towers rising into a sky that seemed too bright, roads wider than anything I had seen at home, an order and cleanliness that felt almost unreal. For the first few days, I walked around in a kind of daze, convinced that I had finally stepped into the life I had been promising myself for years. I called my mother and described everything in detail, the buildings, the malls, the highways, and I could hear the pride in her voice even through the static of the line. For a moment, it felt like every sacrifice was already justified, but that feeling did not last long. The job I had been hired for was nothing like what had been described to me before I left. The hours were long, often stretching far beyond what was fair, and the work itself was physically exhausting in a way I had not prepared for. I shared a small room with several other men, all of us from different parts of India, all of us chasing some version of the same dream. We barely had time to talk about anything except work, sleep, and the occasional shared meal that reminded us, briefly, of home. What surprised me most was how expensive everything actually was. Back in my hometown, people only talked about the income, the number that sounded enormous when converted into rupees. No one talked about the cost of living, the rent, the transportation, the small expenses that quietly ate away at a salary every single month. By the time I paid for my share of the room, food, and the money I sent home out of pride more than necessity, there was very little left to save. I told myself this was temporary, that things would improve once I settled in, once I understood the system better, once I worked hard enough to prove myself. So I worked. I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. I picked up extra shifts whenever they were offered. I skipped outings with the other men in my room, telling myself that every hour of rest I gave up was an hour closer to the life I wanted to build. In the beginning, I called home every single day. I would describe small details of my life, ask about everyone, laugh at my younger cousin's jokes through the phone, listen to my mother complain lovingly about my father's stubbornness. Those calls were the only thing that made the exhaustion feel worth it. I did not notice at first how the rhythm of those calls began to change. It started small, a missed call here, a shorter conversation there, a promise to call back the next day that sometimes slipped to 2 days, then 3. I told myself it was simply the difference in time zones, the difference in our schedules, nothing more. I did not yet understand that this was the beginning of something much larger, something that would take years for me to fully recognize. The first birthday I missed was my younger sister's. I remember feeling guilty, but I also remember telling myself it was just one birthday, that there would be many more, that this sacrifice now meant a better future for her later. I sent money instead of presents. I told myself money was a fair substitute. It was the first of many times I would make that same silent exchange in my mind, telling myself that what I was sending was enough to make up for what I could not give. What I did not understand then, what I would only understand many years later, is that some things cannot be paid back later. Some moments, once missed, are simply gone. At the time, though, I believed completely that I was making the right choice. I believed that this was simply the price of building a future. I had no idea how high that price would eventually become, or how much of myself I would lose in the process of trying to pay it. The first year passed faster than I expected, and slower than I wanted, both at the same time. Days blurred into one another in a way that made it hard to remember which week was which. Work, sleep, a few hours of rest, and then work again. I started to measure time differently than I used to, not by seasons or festivals, but by salary cycles and the rare days off when I could finally sleep past sunrise. I told myself this was simply the price of the early years. Every man I had ever heard stories about had gone through something similar, I reasoned. No one came back successful without first surviving a difficult beginning, so I kept pushing forward, convinced that if I simply endured long enough, the hardship would eventually turn into comfort, and the comfort would eventually turn into the life I had promised my parents. The money I sent home did help. There is no denying that. My father was able to fix the roof that had been leaking for years. My sister's wedding, when it finally came, was a little bigger than we had originally planned, and I remember feeling a strange mixture of pride and absence when I watched the videos later on my phone, sitting alone in my small room thousands of kilometers away. I had paid for parts of that wedding, yet I was not there to see my sister's face when she put on her wedding clothes for the first time. I had paid for the new roof, yet I was not there during the rains that finally stayed outside the house instead of inside it. Slowly, I began to understand a truth that no one had warned me about. Money could change my family's circumstances, but it could not replace my presence in their lives. Still, I did not let myself dwell on that thought for too long. Whenever it surfaced, I pushed it back down with the same justification I always used. This is temporary. This is for the future. This is what a good son and a good brother does. I had built an entire identity around being the one who sacrifices, the one who endures hardship so that others do not have to. It felt noble. It felt necessary. What I did not realize was how much that identity was slowly hollowing me out from the inside. By the second year, I noticed the changes in our phone calls more clearly. My mother still asked about my health, still worried about whether I was eating properly, but the conversations had become shorter, more functional. We had run out of the small details that used to fill our talks, the gossip from the neighborhood, the little arguments between relatives, the jokes that only made sense if you were there to witness the moment they happened. I was no longer present for any of it. so there was less and less to share. Our conversations became updates rather than connections. How is work? Did you receive the money? Take care of your health. I love you. Take care. I have to go now. I told myself this was normal, that every family adjusts to distance this way. I did not yet understand that this was not adjustment. It was erosion, happening so slowly that none of us noticed until much later how much had already been lost. Around this time, I started comparing myself constantly to other men from my hometown who had also gone abroad. Some of them seemed to be doing remarkably well, posting photographs of new cars, new phones, family trips, and renovated homes. I had no way of knowing the full truth behind those photographs, the loans they may have taken, the debts they were hiding, the pressure they were under to maintain an image. All I saw was the surface, and the surface made me feel as though I was failing. I worked even harder, convinced that I simply was not trying enough, that the gap between their success and mine was a gap I could close through sheer effort alone. This is when I started taking on extra work outside of my regular job, doing small additional tasks for other companies whenever I had any free time at all. I barely slept. I barely ate properly, often surviving on quick, cheap meals that did nothing for my health but saved a little money. I stopped going out completely, even on the rare occasions my roommates invited me. I told myself I could not afford the time or the money, but the truth was deeper than that. I had convinced myself that any moment not spent working was a moment wasted, a moment stolen from my family's future. Looking back now, I can see how dangerous that mindset became. I was not building a future. I was slowly erasing myself in the present, believing that erasure was the same thing as sacrifice. The third year brought a different kind of loss. My closest friend from childhood got married, and for the first time, I was not even invited to be part of the smaller pre-wedding events that friends usually share together. It was not done out of cruelty. It was simply practical. I was not there. I could not participate. So naturally, the planning happened without me. When I saw the photographs later, I recognized almost no one in some of the group pictures. New friends had entered his life, friends who had been present for the moments I had missed. I realized, with a sinking feeling I could not quite name at the time, that life back home had not paused while I was away. It had simply continued, with or without me. I called my friend to congratulate him, and the conversation was warm but strange, filled with a kind of polite distance that had not existed between us before. We used to know every detail of each other's daily lives. Now we were catching up like distant cousins, exchanging only the headlines of our existence. I hung up the phone that day and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the ceiling of my small room, trying to understand what exactly I was losing in exchange for the money I kept sending home. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it is important. During this time, I did not yet see myself as someone who had made a mistake. I still believed completely in the plan. I told myself that friendships change naturally as people grow older, that this had nothing to do with Dubai or distance, that it would have happened anyway. I needed to believe that, because the alternative, admitting that my choices were costing me more than I was gaining, was too painful to face directly. So I kept working. I kept sending money home. I kept telling my parents that everything was going well, that I was happy, that the sacrifice was worth it. In some strange way, I think I was trying to convince myself as much as I was trying to convince them. Every time I said the words, "it's worth it," out loud, I was hoping that saying them enough times would eventually make them feel true again, the way they had felt true on that very first day I called my mother from the airport, describing the towers and the lights and the impossible brightness of a city that I still believed, somewhere deep down, was going to give me everything I had ever wanted. By the fourth year, something inside me had started to shift, though I could not yet name what it was. I remember sitting in my room one evening, scrolling through old photographs on my phone, and realizing that almost none of the recent pictures included me. There were photographs of my niece's first birthday, of family gatherings during festivals, of relatives I had grown up with celebrating milestones together. In every single one I was missing, not because anyone had excluded me on purpose, but simply because I was not there. I had become the person in the family who existed mostly through phone calls and bank transfers, a presence felt mainly through absence. I think that was the night I first allowed myself to feel something I had been avoiding for years. Not just tiredness, but a kind of loneliness that went deeper than missing my family. It was the loneliness of realizing that the life I had imagined for myself in Dubai, the version where I would return home triumphant, financially secure, and surrounded by the same warmth I had left behind, was not actually waiting for me. The warmth I remembered was a memory frozen at the moment I left, and the world had kept moving without me ever since. Financially, things were better than when I first arrived, but not in the way I had once imagined. I had paid off a few family debts, contributed to my sister's wedding, helped repair our home, but I had very little saved for myself. Every time I came close to building a small cushion of savings, something would happen. A medical expense back home, an unexpected cost in Dubai, a relative who needed help with school fees. I never resented helping. That was never the issue. The issue was that I had built my entire sense of purpose around being the provider, and in doing so, I had stopped asking myself a simple question: what was I actually building for my own life? I remember calling my mother one night, exhausted after a long shift, and she asked me almost casually when I planned to come back home for good. I did not have an answer. I told her soon, the same word I had been using for years, a word that had started to lose all meaning even to me. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said, "Your father is getting older, Vikrant. We do not need more money. We need you." I remember sitting in the dark after that call, unable to respond to her in the moment, because I did not know how to explain that I had convinced myself money and presence were somehow interchangeable, when deep down, I think I always knew they were not. Around this time, I also began noticing changes in myself that worried me. I'd always been someone who enjoyed talking, who enjoyed being around people, who found energy in conversation. But the years of isolation, of long hours and limited social contact, had changed something in me. I found it harder to engage in conversations that were not strictly necessary. I had grown used to silence, used to keeping things inside, used to functioning rather than truly living. When I did interact with people outside of work, I noticed a kind of emotional distance in myself that had not existed before, as though I had built walls without ever deciding to build them. It was during this period that I lost contact with one of the closest friends I had made in Dubai itself, a man named Rajesh, who had been going through the same struggles as I was. We used to talk often in the early years, sharing our frustrations, encouraging each other, reminding one another why we had come here in the first place. But as the years passed, even that friendship faded. He eventually returned to India, deciding the sacrifice was no longer worth what it was costing him. Before he left, he told me something I did not want to hear at the time. He said, "Vikrant, I am scared that men like us will wake up one day and realize we spent the best years of our lives chasing something that was never really there." I dismissed his words then. I told myself he was simply tired, that he had given up too early, that some people were not strong enough to see the sacrifice through to the end. Looking back now, I understand he was not weak at all. He was simply honest with himself sooner than I was willing to be. The 5th year brought the hardest blow of all. My father fell seriously ill, and for the first time since I had left, I felt the true weight of the distance between us. I remember sitting in my small room, holding my phone, listening to my mother's voice break as she described what was happening, feeling utterly powerless thousands of kilometers away. I wanted to fly back immediately, but work commitments, financial concerns, and the practical difficulties of arranging everything quickly meant that several agonizing days passed before I could actually return home. Walking into the hospital room and seeing my father look smaller and more fragile than I remembered him is an image I do not think I will ever fully forget. He managed a weak smile when he saw me, and the first thing he said was not about his illness. He said, "You came." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of every missed birthday, every missed wedding, every missed ordinary evening I had not been present for over the past several years. I sat beside his bed that night, holding his hand, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to cry without trying to stop it. My father recovered slowly, and during the weeks I stayed at home caring for him, something inside me began to crack open. I spent time with my mother in a way I had not in years, simply sitting together, talking about small things, rebuilding pieces of a connection that had quietly worn thin. I saw how much my niece had grown, how she barely recognized me at first, how she clung to my sister rather than to me, the uncle she barely knew. I realized, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, how much of my family's life had continued to unfold without me. Year after year, while I remained convinced that earning money was the most important thing I could give them. When the time came to return to Dubai, I remember standing at the airport with my mother, and instead of the usual tearful but hopeful goodbye, there was a heaviness between us that neither of us spoke about directly. She hugged me longer than usual. She did not ask when I would come back this time, I think, somewhere inside, we both already understood that whatever I had been searching for in Dubai, it was not going to be found through more years of the same sacrifice. But I was not yet ready to admit that to myself, not completely. I boarded that flight telling myself I simply needed a little more time, a little more money, just a little more before everything would finally make sense. The flight back to Dubai felt different from every flight before it. I remember staring out the window at the clouds, replaying my father's 2 words in my mind, "You came," and feeling a kind of quiet shame I had never allowed myself to feel before. Not shame about working hard, not shame about wanting a better life for my family. Shame about how easily I had convinced myself, year after year, that absence could be measured out and balanced against money, as though love worked the same way a bank account did. For the first few months after returning, I tried to continue exactly as before. I told myself the visit home had simply been emotional, that things would settle back into their normal rhythm once I returned to work. But something had shifted, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not force myself back into the same mindset I had carried for 5 years. I started noticing things I had been too exhausted to notice before. How empty my room felt, how mechanical my days had become, how rarely I laughed anymore, even quietly, even alone. I began reaching out to people from my hometown more deliberately, not out of obligation, but because I genuinely missed them. Some conversations felt warm and familiar, picking up almost where we had left off years earlier. Others felt strained, the kind of politeness that exists between people who used to be close, but have since become more like acquaintances who share a history rather than a present. I had to accept that some relationships simply could not be rebuilt the way they once were, no matter how much I wanted them to be. That realization was painful, but it was also strangely freeing. I stopped pretending that everything could eventually be repaired if I just worked hard enough. It was around this time that I made one of the most difficult decisions of my life. I began seriously considering whether staying in Dubai indefinitely was actually the right path for me, or whether I had simply continued out of habit, out of fear of admitting that years of sacrifice had not delivered the transformation I had once imagined. This was not an easy thought to sit with. Admitting it meant confronting the possibility that I had spent some of the most important years of my adult life chasing a version of success that may never have been fully within reach to begin with, at least not in the way I had originally pictured it. I started speaking more honestly with my mother during our calls, no longer hiding behind reassurances that everything was fine. I told her, for the first time, how tired I was, how lonely the years had felt, how much I regretted missing the small moments more than I had ever expected to. She listened quietly, and then she said something I will never forget. She told me that she and my father had never actually asked me to chase wealth in the way I had chased it. They had only ever wanted me to be safe, to be well, and eventually to come home. The rest, she said, had always been my own idea of what success needed to look like. That conversation changed something fundamental in how I saw the past several years. I had built an entire identity, an entire sacrifice, around an expectation that had largely come from within myself, shaped by the stories I grew up hearing, the comparisons I made with other men, the silent competition I had created in my own mind. My family had never demanded the price I made myself pay. I had simply assumed it was the price required, and I had paid it in full, often without question. Over the following months, I slowly began making changes. I started saving more deliberately, not endlessly sending every spare amount home out of guilt, but creating a real plan for my own future as well as theirs. I allowed myself, for the first time in years, to take occasional breaks, to build a few genuine friendships in Dubai, instead of isolating myself completely. I reconnected gradually with Rajesh, the friend who had once told me he feared men like us would wake up one day having lost the best years of our lives. When we spoke again, I finally told him he had been right. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply said he was glad I had reached that understanding while there was still time to do something with it. Eventually, I made the decision to return home for good. It was not an easy choice, financially or emotionally. Leaving Dubai meant leaving behind a stable income, an established routine, a life I had spent the better part of a decade building, even if that life had cost me more than I had ever intended to give. But staying any longer, chasing a version of success that had already proven hollow, felt like a much greater risk than starting over. Coming home permanently was not the triumphant return I had once imagined as a young man boarding his first flight to Dubai. There was no grand celebration, no crowd of admiring neighbors, No dramatic transformation of my family's circumstances overnight. What I found instead was something quieter, and in many ways, far more valuable. I found my parents, older now, more fragile, but still there, still willing to make space for me in their daily lives. I found my sister, now a mother herself, slowly allowing her daughter to know me not as the uncle who sent money from far away, but as someone present in her everyday world. Rebuilding those relationships took time. It was not instant, and it was not always comfortable. There were moments when I felt like an outsider in my own home, having missed so many ordinary days that had shaped my family's life without me. But unlike the years I had spent in Dubai, these were moments I could actually be present for, conversations I could actually have, memories I could actually start building instead of simply funding from a distance. Looking back now, at 33 years old, I do not regret going to Dubai. I do not regret working hard or wanting a better life for my family. What I regret is believing, for so many years, that money alone could measure the value of my sacrifice, and that presence was something that could always wait until later. I learned, in the hardest way possible, that some years, once spent, cannot be earned back, no matter how much money eventually arrives to compensate for their absence. If I could speak to the younger version of myself, the one boarding that flight with so much hope and so little understanding of what he was truly trading away, I would not tell him to stay home instead. I would tell him to remember, every single day, that the people waiting for him were not asking him to become someone impressive. They were simply asking him to come back eventually, as himself. I do not know if I became rich in the way I once dreamed of becoming, but I know now that the wealth I was actually searching for all along was never going to be found in Dubai. It was waiting for me at home, in the ordinary, unremarkable moments I had once been too eager to trade away.